July of 2012, the ground in eastern Oklahoma cracked open like something beneath it had tried to rise, and failed. This wasn't the dry of late fall. Not the kind of summer people were used to. This was the kind of dry that made everything go quiet. The grass didn't turn green to yellow. It went from green to gray, brittle, lifeless. When the wind moved across it, there was no soft rustle. Just a sharp, hollow sound, like stepping on dead leaves. The cattle stood in the middle of it. They didn't graze. They just stood there. And sometimes, one would lift its head and let out a long, empty bawl. A sound that didn't belong to people, but to something that used to be here, and wasn't anymore. That morning, Caleb Turner stood against a wooden fence, looking across at the neighbor's field. 3 trucks lined up along the road. They were loading cattle. No shouting, no rushing, just quiet, steady work. The kind you do when the decision's already been made. A calf slipped stepping onto the trailer. The man behind it nudged it forward, firm, but not rough. The calf got up, kept moving. No one said a word. Caleb watched the whole thing. He didn't count the cattle. He didn't need to. When someone starts selling in July, it means they've run out of options. You haven't called anyone yet. The voice came from behind him. Caleb turned. Daniel stood there, hands on his hips, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He'd just come from the back lot, where the water tanks had been dropping all week. No, Caleb said. Daniel looked back toward the trucks. Prices are falling, he said. Millers sold yesterday. Lost nearly 30% from May. Caleb didn't answer. The wind carried dust across the fence line. Dad, Daniel said, quieter now. If we wait, we're going to sell into the same market. Maybe worse. Caleb kept watching the emptying field. Hoof prints pressed into dry soil. Flattened patches where cattle had stood. Maybe we don't sell everything, Daniel continued. Maybe half. 40 head. Gone in a single afternoon. We still have grass, Caleb said. Daniel turned to face him. Not enough, he replied. Not if this goes another 2 weeks. We've already burned through most of the reserve. Caleb didn't argue. The numbers were right. Feed was down. Water was low. No rain in sight. Everything pointed one way. Everything. Except one thing. Caleb turned and looked behind him. Not at the whole pasture. Just a section. A strip running along the slope, where the grass wasn't gray. Not bright green, but still green. A deeper color. Holding on. The wind passed over it, and this time, there was sound. Soft. Alive. Daniel followed his gaze. He went quiet. That spot, he said, then stopped. They both knew what he meant. That place. The one people joked about. Grass too tall. Too wild. To be useful. The one Caleb had never plowed under. You can't carry the whole herd on that, Daniel said. Caleb nodded once. I know. Across the fence, the last trailer door slammed shut. A sharp metallic sound. The engine started. The truck pulled away, taking with it cattle that had been standing on green pasture just 2 months ago. Daniel watched it go. That's going to be us, he said. No anger in his voice. Just truth. Caleb didn't look at the road. He kept his eyes on the green strip, longer than he needed to, like he was trying to remember something said long before this drought began. Your grandfather used to say something, Caleb said slowly. Daniel turned. What? Caleb didn't answer right away. He bent down, picked up a handful of dry soil, and squeezed it. It broke apart instantly, fell through his fingers like dust. He stood again, looked back at the green. He said there'd be a year when everything dies at once. The wind eased for a moment, and in that year, Caleb continued, the only thing left standing would be what was here before we ever showed up. Daniel said nothing. He looked back at the pasture. That strip of green wasn't much. Not enough, by any calculation, but it wasn't dead. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. Caleb took a slow breath, not deep, just steady. "I'm not selling," he said. Daniel didn't react right away. He just stood there, trying to decide if what he was hearing was belief or a mistake. "Dad, I'm not selling," Caleb said again, stronger this time. Dust still hung in the distance where the trucks had gone. The neighbor's field was empty. This one wasn't. Caleb Turner stood at the fence line, in a summer where everything was beginning to die, and chose to hold on to the one thing everyone else had already let go. Caleb didn't walk back to the house right away. He stayed at the fence long after the trucks disappeared, long after the dust settled back into the road. The field across from him was empty now. Too empty. No movement, no sound, just dry ground holding the shape of what used to be there. He turned back toward his own pasture, toward the strip of grass that hadn't gone gray. It didn't stand out from a distance. You had to look for it. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Daniel walked down the fence line and stopped beside him again. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wind shifted, carrying a different smell this time. Not dust. Not dry hay. Something. Green. "You remember what this place looked like when I was a kid?" Daniel asked. Caleb nodded once. "Different," he said. That was the word people used when they didn't want to argue. Different meant too tall, too uneven, too wild. Different meant it didn't look like the other pastures in the county. "Why didn't you ever plant fescue here?" Daniel asked. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time the question mattered. Caleb rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. "For the same reason your grandfather didn't," he said. "That's not an answer." "It is," Caleb replied. "You just don't like it." Daniel exhaled, frustrated but holding it in. "Everyone else did it," he said. "They doubled their stocking rates. They made more money." "In good years," Caleb said. Daniel didn't respond, because that part was true. "Your grandfather had a man come out here in the 60s, Caleb continued. "County agent. Told him to spray everything, plow it under, seed fescue. Said it'd change the whole place in 2 seasons. Daniel looked out across the pasture again. "And he said no." Caleb nodded. "He said the grass that's here learned this ground. The grass they wanted to bring in didn't." The wind moved again, pressing through the tall stems along the slope. A soft sound. Living. "He ever explained that?" Daniel asked. "No," Caleb said. "He didn't explain much." They stood there, watching the strip of green shift under the breeze. Everything else around it stayed still. "He was wrong sometimes," Daniel said. Caleb nodded. "Yeah. But not about this." Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked out over the rest of the land. At the gray fields stretching past the fence lines. At the hills that had all turned the same color. At the places where nothing moved anymore. Then back at the green. "We're about to find out." Daniel shifted his weight. "You're asking a lot from that patch," he said. "I'm not asking," Caleb replied. Daniel frowned slightly. "Then what are you doing?" Caleb looked down at the soil near his boots. Dry on top, it as the rest. "Not yet. I'm trusting it," he said. Daniel let that sit for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "That's not how this works anymore." Caleb almost smiled. "Maybe that's the problem." They heard the cattle before they saw them. Slow steps, hooves dragging a little more than they used to. The herd was moving toward the lower side of the pasture, toward the green. They didn't need to be pushed, didn't need to be called. They were finding it on their own. Daniel watched them go. All of them are heading there, he said. Yeah. That won't last. Caleb didn't respond. He just watched. The first cow stepped into the taller grass, lowered her head, pulled a mouthful, chewed, didn't lift her head right away, didn't hesitate. Another followed, then another. The movement spread through the herd, slow but certain. A shift, not dramatic, but real. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They'll take it down fast, he said. Not if I don't let them, Caleb replied. Daniel turned to him. What do you mean? Caleb pushed off the fence. The heat didn't break. By the second week of July, the air itself felt heavy, like it had weight, like it pressed down on the land instead of moving through it. Day after day climbed past 100. Night didn't cool it. It just dimmed the light. Across the county, the pattern repeated. First the grass stopped growing. Then it stopped being green. Then it stopped being anything at all. Fields that had carried cattle in May were empty by mid-July. Trailers moved up and down the roads from dawn to dark. Engines. Dust. Gates opening and closing. Then silence. Caleb saw it everywhere he went. At the feed store, men standing in smaller groups than usual, talking quieter. At the co-op, numbers written down slower, like they mattered more now. At the edge of town, a line of trucks waiting their turn at the sale barn. No one laughed anymore. No one had the room for it. Still holding. Someone asked him one morning. Caleb nodded. That's what I heard, the man said. Don't know how long that's going to last. Caleb didn't answer. He just loaded what little feed he still needed and left. Back on the farm, the cattle had settled into a pattern. They moved with the shade early, drank what water was left, then drifted, almost instinctively, toward the strip of green. Caleb watched them from the rise above it, counted them without meaning to. 80 head, still all there. Daniel joined him, wiping his hands on a rag. We lost another 2 inches out of the tanks, he said. Caleb nodded. I saw. Daniel looked out across the pasture. The gray had spread. What little color had been left in the outer fields was fading now, turning brittle under the heat. Only the strip remained. Holding. They're staying on it longer, Daniel said. Yeah. That's not good. Caleb didn't argue. Because it wasn't. If they grazed it too hard, if they took too much, too fast, it wouldn't matter what kind of grass it was. Everything had a limit. We need to move them, Caleb said. Daniel looked at him. To where? Caleb didn't answer right away. Because there wasn't another option. Not really. We rotate, he said finally. Daniel frowned. Rotate where? There's nothing left. Caleb pointed toward the far end of the strip. Sections, he said. Small ones. Daniel followed his hand. The green wasn't wide, but it was long, running the slope like a seam through the land. You're going to fence that? Daniel asked. Temporary. With what? Wire. Daniel let out a breath, half disbelief, half exhaustion. That's not going to change how much is there. No, Caleb said. But it'll change how fast we use it. That afternoon, they started. Posts first. Driven shallow, just enough to hold. Wire strung between them. Nothing permanent. Just lines drawn across the only living ground they had left. The cattle watched them work, didn't move far, didn't scatter. They stayed close, like they understood what mattered now. By evening, the first section was set, small, barely enough to hold them a day. "Feels like we're buying time," Daniel said. Caleb nodded. "That's exactly what we're doing." They opened the fence just enough to let the herd through. The cattle stepped in slowly at first, then faster, heads down, feeding. Caleb closed the wire behind them, watched how they moved. Not frantic, not desperate, just steady. "Tomorrow we move them again," he said. Daniel nodded, and the next day. Days blurred after that. Heat, dust, work. Move the wire, shift the herd, watch the ground, repeat. The strip held, not the same everywhere. Some sections thinned faster, some held thicker, but it didn't collapse. One afternoon, a truck pulled up at the edge of the road. Not Boyd, not a neighbor, someone from the county. Caleb recognized the truck, even before the man stepped out. Extension office. The man walked down the fence line, hat in his hand, eyes moving across the pasture, then stopping, at the green. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, taking it in. "This yours?" he asked finally. Caleb nodded. The man stepped closer, bent down, ran his hand through the grass, then looked back across the road, at the dead field beyond it, then back again. "I've been out all week," he said quietly. "Haven't seen this anywhere else." Caleb said nothing. "What did you plant here?" the man asked. Caleb shook his head. "Nothing." The man looked at him, not confused, not exactly, just recalculating. "This was already here?" he asked. "Been here longer than me," Caleb said. The man straightened, looked out across the rest of the land again, at the gray, at the empty fields, at the trucks still moving in the distance. Then back at the cattle, still feeding, still steady, still there. "You're not selling," he said. It wasn't a question. Caleb shook his head once. "No." The man stood there for another moment, then nodded slowly, more to himself than to Caleb. "Mind if I come back?" he asked. Caleb shrugged. "Land'll still be here." The man gave a small, quiet smile, then turned and walked back to his truck. Daniel watched him go. "Think he believes it?" he asked. Caleb looked back at the strip, at the cattle, at the ground that hadn't failed yet. "Doesn't matter," he said, "because the truth wasn't in what anyone believed. It was in what was still alive when everything else wasn't." By the end of July, there was no more pretending it might rain. The sky stayed the same color every day, pale, washed out, empty. Clouds would form in the distance, gather just enough shape to raise hope, then disappear before they crossed the ridge. The forecast stopped changing. People stopped checking it. Across the county, the last of the fescue gave up. What hadn't already died, finished dying. Fields turned the same dull gray, flat and uniform, like something had erased the differences between them. The work changed. Not grazing anymore. Survival. Caleb saw it in the way people drove, slower, not because they had time, because they didn't know what came next. One afternoon, Daniel came in from the back lot carrying a bucket that didn't need carrying. "It's down again," he said. Caleb looked up. "How much?" "Another inch." That was the problem now, not just feed, water. Caleb stepped outside and walked with him to the tanks. The metal sides were hot to the touch. Inside,
The water line had dropped low enough to expose a ring of mineral stain that hadn't seen air in years. "How long?" Daniel asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He didn't need to measure. He could see it. "Not long." Daniel looked out toward the pasture. Toward the strip. "They're still holding," he said. "Yeah, but water won't." Caleb nodded. That part wasn't negotiable. That evening, he walked the fence alone. Not checking. Not fixing. Just walking. The way his father used to. He moved slow, boots pressing into ground that felt different with every step. Dry, here. Holding there. Changing. When he reached the upper edge of the strip, he stopped. Looked down across it. The grass was shorter now. Used, but not gone. He stepped into it. The air changed slightly under the cover. Cooler. Not by much, but enough to notice. He crouched and pushed his hand into the soil. The top was dry, it always would be, but just below, it held. He dug his fingers deeper. Felt resistance. Weight. Something the rest of the pasture didn't have anymore. Caleb sat back on his heels. Looked out across the land. At the fields that had already failed. At the ones that were about to. At the road where fewer trucks were moving now, because there was less left to haul. He stayed there until the light started to drop. Then stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and walked back toward the house. The next morning, the extension agent returned. Earlier this time, before the heat had settled in. He parked in the same place, stepped out slower, like he already knew what he was coming to see. Caleb met him at the fence. They didn't shake hands. Didn't need to. The man looked out across the pasture again, longer this time, taking in the whole picture. Gray on one side.
Green on the other. "I drove past Wilkerson's place on the way here," he said. "He's done." Caleb nodded once. "I figured. He sold everything that could walk." They stood there in silence for a moment. Then the man stepped through the fence into the strip. He moved slowly, carefully, like he didn't want to disturb something. He knelt down, ran his hand along the stems, then pushed his fingers into the soil, held them there. When he pulled his hand back, he didn't wipe it off right away. Just looked at it, at the dirt, at what it held. "This isn't just the grass," he said quietly. Caleb didn't respond. "It's the ground," the man continued. "The ground's different." Caleb leaned against the fence. "Been that way a long time." The man nodded slowly. "How long you been running it like this?" Caleb shrugged. "My whole life." "And before that?" "My father's." The man looked out again. Further this time. As if trying to see past what was in front of him. "We've been telling people to tear this out for decades," he said. It wasn't said like a defense. Or an excuse. Just a statement. Caleb pushed off the fence and stepped into the strip beside him. "Worked fine," he said. "Most years." The man let out a quiet breath. "Yeah." Then he looked back at the gray field across the road. At the one that had followed every recommendation. Every program. Every improvement. "That's the problem," he said. Caleb didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. "You optimize for the years that are easy," the man continued. "And you forget about the ones that aren't." The wind moved through the grass again. Soft. Alive. The man stood up, brushed his hands together slowly, then looked at Caleb. "If someone wanted to bring this back," he said, gesturing to the strip, "how long would it take?" Caleb thought about it. Not the question. The answer. "Years," he said. "How many?" "Enough that most people won't wait." The man nodded. Like that confirmed something he already suspected. They stood there a moment longer. Then the man turned back toward his truck. Stopped halfway. Looked over his shoulder. "You mind if I tell people about this?" he asked. Caleb glanced down at the grass. At the cattle feeding steadily. at the ground that it held when everything else let go. Tell them whatever you want, he said. The man nodded once, then left. Daniel walked up a few minutes later. Same guy, he asked. Yeah. What'd he want? Caleb looked out across the pasture, at the line that separated what survived from what didn't. To understand. Daniel followed his gaze. Didn't say anything. Because the answer wasn't something you explained. It was something you stood in and saw for yourself. The rain came in September. Not all at once, not enough to fix anything overnight. Just a slow return. Thin clouds gathering where the sky had been empty for weeks, a brief darkening in the afternoon, and then, finally, water falling back onto ground that had almost forgotten what it felt like. Across the county, people waited. They watched the fields, waited for green, waited for something to come back. Most of it didn't, not right away. The fescue pastures stayed gray, the crowns had dried too far. The roots had already given up, rain couldn't change that. New growth would come later, but not now, not when it mattered. Caleb stood at the edge of his pasture the morning after the first real rain. The ground was damp on the surface, soft enough to hold a boot print, but it was the strip he looked at. It hadn't come back, because it had never left. The grass stood shorter than it had in spring, worn, used, but still there, still green, still alive. The cattle moved through it slowly, not searching anymore, not pushing, just grazing, steady. Daniel walked up beside him. They're calling it the worst one since '88, he said. Caleb nodded. Feels like it. Daniel looked out across the land beyond their fence. Patches of brown still stretched across the hills. Fields that would need reseeding. Time, money, both. Wilkerson's talking about replanting, Daniel said. Fescue again. Caleb didn't react. Of course he is, he said. Daniel hesitated. Would you? He asked. Caleb took his time before answering. He looked at the pasture, at the strip that had carried them through, at the soil beneath it, the part no one saw. No, he said. Daniel nodded. He didn't argue. Not this time. Because he had seen it. Not heard it. Not been told. Seen it. That afternoon, the extension agent came back one last time. No clipboard. No truck full of pamphlets. Just himself. He stood at the fence again, looking out across the pasture, longer than before, like he was trying to fix the image in his mind. I wrote something up, he said finally. Recommendation. Pilot program. Native restoration. Caleb leaned on the fence. Think they'll go for it. The man let out a small breath. Some will. Most won't. Caleb nodded. That sounded about right. Takes too long, the man added. Costs too much. Doesn't pay quick. Caleb looked back out at the pasture. Yeah, he said, that's the problem. The man turned slightly toward him. You ever think about converting the rest? He asked. Caleb shook his head. No. Why not? Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched a cow move through the grass, slow and steady, tearing off another mouthful, chewing like nothing had ever been wrong. Because this already works, he said. The man followed his gaze, at the cattle, at the grass, at the ground that had held through heat that broke everything else. Then he nodded, slow, certain. I should have been out here years ago, he said quietly. Caleb didn't respond. The man looked out one last time, then turned back toward his truck, stopped, and spoke without looking back. You weren't wrong, he said. Then he left. That evening, the sky cleared again, the air cooled just enough to notice. Caleb stood alone at the edge of the strip, hands resting on the fence, looking out across land that had tested everything he knew. Behind him, the house sat quiet. In front of him, the pasture moved with the wind. He thought about his father, about his grandfather, about the years before him that had shaped the ground he was standing on. They hadn't left him instructions. They hadn't left him numbers. They hadn't explained anything. They had just left it as it was, and trusted that one day, that would be enough. Caleb looked down at the soil beneath his boots, then back out at the grass. We didn't make this. He let the words settle, not as a statement, as an understanding. We just kept it. The wind moved through the pasture again, soft, steady, carrying the sound of something that had survived, not because it was stronger, but because it had always belonged there. Caleb Turner stood there until the light faded, on land that had outlasted every season thrown at it, and would outlast the next one too.